The stone is cold beneath your bare feet. Each breath tears at your throat like shards of glass. Behind you, the darkness of the alley swallows your footprints, but ahead lies only more shadow, more danger, more distance between you and a dream that's already dying. Your lungs burn, your legs scream for mercy. But mercy is not a word that exists in your world. Not for you, not for what you are. The leather thong around your ankle has left its mark so deep it's become part of your skin, a phantom chain even when the iron is gone. And now, running through these nameless streets in the dead of night, you can almost taste something you've never known. Freedom, almost. I'm genuinely curious to drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. It amazes me every time that a story this dark, this ancient, reaches people across the entire world. There's something about these forgotten lives that refuses to stay buried. Her name is lost to history. Let's call her Lucia, common name for an uncommon act of defiance. The year is 78 CE, during the reign of Vespasian, when Rome's appetite for conquest has filled its streets with human cargo. Slaves constitute nearly a third of the empire's population. Estimates suggest 3 million people living as property. Women like Lucia exist in a particular kind of hell, their bodies commodified, their labor endless, their autonomy a legal impossibility. The Digest of Justinian, compiled centuries later, but reflecting Republican and early imperial law, makes it clear. A slave who flees commits fuga, an act of theft, stealing oneself from one's rightful owner. For a woman to commit such theft, to assert ownership over her own body, is not merely criminal. It's philosophically grotesque to the Roman mind. It's chaos disguised as courage. Lucia had served in the household of Marcus Tullius Varro, a mid-tier merchant in the Subura district. Not wealthy enough to be cruel with imagination, but successful enough to own 12 slaves. She worked the grinding stones, prepared meals, carried water from the public fountain. Her hands were calloused leather, her back a map of old welts. But 3 nights ago, something shifted. Perhaps it was the arrival of a new slave, a Greek woman who still had fire in her eyes and whispered about boats leaving Ostia for Massilia. Perhaps it was simply that Lucia could no longer endure the weight of her own powerlessness. She waited until the household slept, slipped through the courtyard, and ran. For 2 days, she moved like smoke through the city. She stole figs from market stalls, drank from public fountains, hid in the ruins of burned insulae. She made it as far as the Via Appia, where the tombs of the dead offered shelter to the living. She believed foolishly, desperately, that if she could just reach the coast, blend into a crowd of travelers, bribe her way onto a ship with labor or lies, she might vanish into the world beyond Rome's reach. But Rome's reach is infinite. They found her on the 3rd morning, curled beneath an archway, exhausted beyond consciousness. 2 slave hunters, fugitive airmen, who made their living tracking runaways with the efficiency of wolves. They worked with dogs, with informants, with a network of eyes that saw everything the city tried to hide. One of them yanked her upright by her hair. The other looped a rope around her wrists with the casual ease of a man tying a market bundle. She didn't scream. She didn't beg. She had known on some level that this was inevitable. Roman law didn't just punish escape, it made punishment into theater, into pedagogy, into a public sermon on the dangers of hope. The walk back to the city was a parade of humiliation. They didn't hide her. They led her through the busiest streets at midday, the rope around her neck like a leash, her tunic torn and filthy. Shopkeepers paused. Children pointed. Other slaves looked away, their faces carefully blank, each of them thinking, "That could be me. That will never be me." I would never be so foolish. The message was already being delivered before a single formal punishment began. Roman law surrounding runaway slaves was codified with chilling precision. The Lex Fabia de Plagiaries from 209 BCE made it illegal to harbor or conceal a fugitive slave, punishable by severe fines. Owners had the right to brand runaways with the letter F for fugitivis on the forehead or chica mark that would follow them forever. A scarlet letter burned into flesh, but the law also granted masters near total discretion in punishment. A slave had no legal personhood, no right to trial, no appeal. The only limit on an owner's cruelty was his imagination and occasionally public opinion, though even that was flexible when it came to runaways, who were seen as threats to the entire social order. Lucia was dragged into the Forum Boarium, where a wooden platform had been erected for market auctions. But today it served a different purpose. A crowd gathered, drawn by the spectacle like flies to rotting fruit. Varro stood to the side, arms crossed, his face carved from granite. He had paid the fugitivary their fee 30 denarii, the price of a month's grain for a family. Now he would reclaim his investment and ensure no other slave in his household would ever dream of flight. The first punishment was branding. A brazier had been set up, coals glowing white-hot, an iron rod nestled among them. The letter F at its tip glowed like a fragment of the sun. 2 men held Lucia's arms, a third grabbed her jaw, forcing her head to the side, exposing her cheek. She closed her eyes. The crowd leaned in, a collective held breath. Then the iron touched skin. The sound came first, hiss, sharp and wet, like meat on a grill. Then the smell, acrid and nauseating, the scent of burning flesh mingling with the sweat of the crowd. Lucia's scream tore through the forum, raw and animal, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than her lungs, from some ancient well of suffering that all enslaved people carry within them. The iron held for 3 seconds on, eternity then pulled away, leaving behind a blackened, bubbling wound in the shape of a letter that would never fade, never heal cleanly, never let her forget. But that was only the beginning. Roman punishments for runaways were designed to escalate, to layer suffering upon suffering until the person beneath was unrecognizable. Branding was public humiliation, a mark of shame, but it didn't break the body. For that, there were other methods. Lucia was taken from the Forum to a Pistrinima grain mill on the outskirts of the city. These were places of legendary horror, where slaves worked in near-total darkness, chained to massive grinding stones that never stopped turning. The air inside was thick with dust, a choking fog that coated lungs and eyes and turned every breath into a rasp. The overseers were former slaves themselves, men who had survived by becoming instruments of the system that had once broken them. They greeted Lucia with indifference. She was just another body, another pair of hands to push the stone. The work was simple and soul-destroying. She was chained by the ankle to a wooden beam attached to the millstone. Her job was to walk in an endless circle, pushing the stone around and around, grinding wheat into flour. The stone weighed hundreds of pounds and never stopped. If she slowed, the whip came quick, sharp, a line of fire across her shoulders. The shift lasted from dawn to dusk, 16 hours of circular walking, her muscles screaming, her mind fracturing into fragments of memory and hallucination. Pliny the Elder wrote of these mills, describing them as places where slaves were ground down as surely as the grain. The mortality rate was staggering. Most workers lasted less than 2 years before their bodies gave out infections, exhaustion, respiratory failure from the constant dust. Women like Lucia were particularly vulnerable. Their frames, often smaller, less muscular, bore the weight with even greater difficulty, and the psychological toll was its own form of death. The endless repetition, the darkness, the removal of any horizon or hope, these things killed the spirit long before the body failed. Lucia lasted 6 months in the mill. Her hair turned gray, her skin became corpse pale, covered in a fine layer of grain dust that never fully washed away. The brand on her cheek became infected, then scarred into a raised, angry keloid. She stopped speaking, stopped thinking in words. Her mind became a blank rhythmic hum, a pulse synchronized with the grinding stone. Walk, push, turn, walk, push, turn. The world contracted to that single, suffocating circle. But even that wasn't enough, because Lucia had done something unforgivable. She had imagined herself free, and in Rome, imagination was the most dangerous crime of all. One morning, without explanation, she was pulled from the mill and loaded onto a cart. She didn't ask where they were taking her. She didn't have the energy to care. The cart rolled south for 3 days, following the Via Latina through the Alban Hills and into Campania. The destination was a place whispered about in slave quarters, a name that made even the overseers fall silent. The mines of Batare, silver mines near the Bay of Naples. The Roman Empire ran on metal silver for coins, iron for weapons, lead for plumbing, and metal came from the earth, extracted by human bodies in conditions that defied comprehension. Strabo, the Greek geographer, described these mines as hellish places where the sun never reaches and the air itself is poison. Diodorus Siculus wrote of miners in Spain and Italy working in tunnels so narrow they had to crawl, chained at the ankle, their backs bent double, their lungs filling with rock dust and toxic fumes. The average life expectancy for a mine slave was measured in months, not years. Lucia was assigned to a tunnel crew. 20 women, all branded, all runaways, all sent here to die slowly in the dark. They were given crude iron picks and bowls for carrying, or no lamps, too dangerous, too expensive. The only light came from small oil flames near the entrance, guttering shadows that barely penetrated the blackness. The tunnel was 4 feet high, forcing them to work on their knees or bellies. The air was thick, humid, choking, tasting of sulfur and decay. Water dripped constantly from the ceiling, pooling in the low spots, mixing with blood and urine and the chemical slurry of broken rock. They worked in shifts of 12 hours, though time lost all meaning in the darkness. Lucia swung her pick at the rock face until her arms went numb, until blisters burst and bled and reformed as calluses. She filled her bowl with ore, crawled backward through the tunnel, dumped it into a larger cart, then crawled back to the face and started again. No talking, no stopping. The overseers patrolled with whips and clubs, their silhouettes monstrous in the flickering light. If you collapsed, they dragged you out and left you at the entrance. If you died, they left your body where it fell until the end of the shift. A warning and a prophecy. Lucia watched 3 women die in her first month. One from a tunnel collapse, buried under a ton of rock, her screams cut short with brutal finality. One from fever, her body racked with convulsions, coughing up blood until she simply stopped. One who simply gave up, sat down against the tunnel wall, closed her eyes, and refused to move. The overseers beat her, but she didn't respond. She died there, her body still sitting upright, and for a day they left her as a monument to the cost of surrender. The psychological assault of the mines was, in some ways, worse than the physical. The darkness erased individuality, erased time, erased the boundary between self and stone. Women who had been vibrant, who had laughed and loved and fought, became hollow-eyed automatons. They stopped using names, stopped remembering who they had been. The mines didn't just kill bodies, they erased identities, reduced human beings to their most basic function: labor, dig, crawl, dump, repeat. Lucia's mind fractured. She began to see things in the darkness. Her mother's face, though she barely remembered her mother. Fields of wheat under a blue sky, though she hadn't seen a field in years. The Greek woman from Vero's household, whispering about boats, about Massilia, about freedom. The visions were more real than the rock, more solid than her own hands. She talked to them, argued with them, wept when they disappeared. And then, one day, something shifted. A guard made a mistake, left a gate unlocked, turned his back for too long. It wasn't an opportunity. It was a mirage, a trap, a test. But Lucia, or what was left of Lucia, took it. She stumbled out of the tunnel, blinking in the brutal sunlight, and ran. She made it maybe 200 yards before they caught her. This time, there was no trial, no return to an owner. She had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The penalty for a second escape attempt was death. But not a quick death, not a private death, a death that would serve the Empire's purpose. They took her to the arena at Puteoli, a mid-sized amphitheater on the coast. It wasn't the Colosseum. That wouldn't be built for another few years, but it was large enough, brutal enough, Roman enough. The arena was where the Empire turned violence into art, where punishment became entertainment, where the state's power was made visible in the most visceral way possible. Lucia was kept in a cell beneath the arena for 2 days without food. She could hear the roar of the crowds above, the clash of weapons, the screams of the dying. On the 3rd day, they came for her. They dressed her in rags, gave her no weapon, no armor, no chance. This wasn't a gladiatorial combat. This was an execution disguised as sporta damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts. They led her up the tunnel and into the blinding light of the arena floor. The sand was white, almost beautiful, soaked with old blood that had turned it rust-brown in patches. The crowd roared, a wall of sound that pressed against her like a physical force. 15,000 people, maybe more, their faces a blur of open mouths and hungry eyes. She stood in the center, swaying slightly, her body so broken it could barely hold itself upright. The brand on her cheek had reopened, weeping clear fluid. Her hands hung at her sides, limp, useless. A gate across the arena groaned open. The crowd's roar intensified, anticipation crackling through the air like static. What emerged wasn't a lion or a leopard. Those were reserved for more important executions. It was a pack of dogs, starved and trained to kill. Their ribs visible beneath matted fur, their eyes feral and fixed on the only living thing in the arena. Lucia didn't run. There was nowhere to run. She stood and watched them come. The dogs hit her like a wave, teeth and claws and weight, dragging her down into the blood-soaked sand. The pain was immediate and total, a white-hot obliteration that burned through every nerve. She heard herself screaming, a sound that didn't seem to come from her own throat. The crowd cheered. Vendors moved through the stands, selling wine and roasted nuts. Families laughed. Children pointed. This was Rome's final lesson. Even in death, a slave had no dignity, no privacy, no meaning beyond the message her suffering conveyed. You cannot escape. You cannot resist. You are property, and property that rebels will be destroyed in the most public, the most humiliating, the most absolute way possible. Lucia died in the sand. Her body was dragged out by hooks, tossed into a mass grave outside the city walls, unmarked and unmourned. No record of her real name survived, no tomb, no epitaph. Just a brief notation in an accountant's ledger. One female slave lost to flight and subsequent execution. Value, 400 denarii, total loss. But here's what the Romans couldn't kill: the act itself. The flight? The 2 days of freedom, however desperate, however doomed. In those hours when Lucia ran through the dark streets, when she slept beneath the tombs on the Via Appia, when she imagined a ship carrying her away from everything she had ever known in those hours, she was not property. She was a woman who chose. And that choice, that brief crack in the empire's absolute power, is what they had to crush so brutally, not because she was dangerous, but because the idea of her was. Thousands of women made the same desperate choice, as we know from legal records, scratched graffiti, and the skeletons found in mines and mass graves. Rome relied on their submission, so resistance had to be punished with unforgettable brutality. Yet they kept running enough of them that laws grew harsher and surveillance tighter. But never enough to stop the flow of people choosing risk over chains. Lucia's story lived on in each of them. The arena is ruins now, but in the spaces history left behind, she is still running, still dreaming, and the empire could never kill that.